Well, hello, brothers and sisters. Welcome back to our study of Ruth. We're in the third act right now. This redemption for the nation. And remember, when you think of redemption, you think of the Exodus, where God took Israel out of Egypt, slavery, brought them into the desert, made a covenant with them at Sinai, gave them his laws, and then put them into the promised land, the place of rest. But we've been seeing it through this story, though. In the first act, Naomi tries to send them back to idolatry, back to their ways, like Israel wanted to go back to Egypt. But Ruth didn't. Now, she's remained faithful. She made a covenant with Naomi. She clung to her, just like Israel did in Mount Sinai. She kept the connection to her by leaving her family behind and following, a bit like Abraham did. Which then brought us to the second act, where Boaz, acting a bit like God, brings much blessing upon not an Israelite like Abraham, but a Moabitess, Ruth. And so we saw this blessing that is upon her, and this brings us to the third act, where again, I believe there'll be symbolism and just this introduction that connects us back to the Exodus, to this moment of redemption, as I'll try to show you. And it's interesting that this third act starts with mostly dialogue, because the first act was mostly the narrator talking to us. And then the second one, there was a mixture. The narrator gives us information and some interactions, dialogue. Here, only thing the narrator will tell us is Naomi said, Ruth said. That's it. It's mostly them talking. It's still God talking through them, though. What they say is specifically, it's not everything they said, but what we need to hear, because God wants to speak to us through that, and we want to understand what he's saying. And what's interesting, though, and to take note of, is how all of the second act was in the daytime. All about that day where Ruth worked hard to provide for her and Naomi. And how at the end of the day, she came home. It's the evening. But we know that months have passed, at least 2 months, during the whole season of sowing and reaping, to enter Act 3, where it's still nighttime. Yeah, I think the narrative chunks time. Many months, but doesn't even mention it, because it's still the evening where this is going to happen between Boaz and Ruth. That's interesting. So, like I said, we want to make sense of what is God telling us through Naomi's lips. So, let's look at it together. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" Don't miss the negative twist here, right? Not seek. In the second verse, we'll see the same thing, another negative twist when she speaks of Boaz. I don't think that's for nothing, because when you enter chapter 2, you go back to it. And in verse 8, where Boaz is speaking to Ruth for the first time, and again uses that term, my daughter. Well, here's the way he puts it. Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Right? Two negative twists. Not negative comments per se. Just like here it's not a negative comment, but there's a negative twist to it after she speaks to her daughter. It's interesting. It's interesting how there's parallels and connections between these two people speaking to Ruth with such tender, familial language, right? My daughter, but says don't. Well, technically, what she's saying is, should I not be seeking rest for you? Which brings us back, of course, to the first act, where she had prayed over Orpah and Ruth, that God would be with them and find a place of rest, a home, a family, a husband for them. And after God has invigorated her afresh by his hand of providence, provided and blessed Naomi, she feels like, I need to go back to that promise again. Because I know God will act. I'm reminded how God is amazing. So, yeah, let's go back to this promise I made to you, that God would bring you to a place of rest. Manoah is actually the word here. That should sound familiar to you if you know the book of Judges. Remember, this happened in the time of the Judges. Manoah is Samson's father. That's his name. It means rest. I don't think that's for nothing. Samson is an interesting character for many reasons. One of them being that he's one of the only three people with a birth narrative. Samuel and Jesus being the only two. But God tells us about their coming to be, their birth and everything. That's interesting. Especially that Samson is the one that's going to start delivering his people from his enemies, and Jesus will finish it. And Jesus will be that shalom that brings peace to his people, where Samson was supposed to. And he was the son of the guy of rest. There's subtlety in the language here that we're not supposed to miss, especially if you know just a little bit of the Hebrew. But of course, we understand that Naomi is basically saying, I got to find a husband for you. That's what she wants to do. That's how she's going to help her, is to find a husband for her. And of course, this husband is Boaz. Is not, here's the negative twist, is not Boaz our relative, but whose young women you were. See, he's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Here again is some interesting piece of information. It does seem like the winnowing part, where they take away the shaft and keep only what is food, is done at the end of the harvest, it seems. This is 2 months later. This is at the end of the harvest. Yet, we saw that Ruth at the end of her first day of work did it. And it's the only time it's mentioned that she did it. Almost like she had to do it just so we could know how much she got. Even though the typical way of doing it is at the end of the harvest only. You don't do it before that. It's not ready before that. So it's interesting, right? How God took the time to just show us how abundant it was, but in reality, it should have waited 2 months later. That's also interesting that Naomi knows that Boaz is going to the threshing floor tonight of all the times. How does she know? The same way she knew that there was bread now in Israel, even though she was living in Moab. God's providence. The same providence that led them back exactly when the harvest was beginning. When God's hand at work, the same hand that made sure that Ruth was in Boaz's field when she decided to clean up all the fields that was there. It was God's providence. God's providence is at work for their betterment. It's these details you never want to miss, especially when it says, with whose young women you were. It seems like a useless commentary. Why mention these young women? Just say Boaz and what he's doing. Well, don't forget. In chapter 2, Ruth is told to cling to these young women. Follow them. The same way she followed Naomi in chapter 1. Where she made a covenant with Naomi that she would make her people her people. Well, Naomi's people her people. And Naomi's God her God. And then in chapter 2, through just the word, right, clinging to these servants, we're reminded of how she's covenant. She's made an alliance to say, I'm going to follow God's people. I'm going to be part of God's people. And be under his God. Is the narrator reminding us in a subtle way. This is what Ruth is putting our heart into. Being part of the people of God. Being part of Israel. And this is the sense why she could say Boaz is your relative. Technically, he's not. Ruth married into the family of Elimelech, but once the son died, she was no more part of that family. She was never even part of Israel to begin with. She was a Moabitess. Boaz is not her relative in any way, shape, or form, other than she chooses to be part of that family. That's what that little phrase, I believe, reminds us of. She chose to be part of the family of God. And that's why Boaz had become a bit like for us. Jesus came to seek and save the Jews. He came for his people. And we're given that option as well. If we turn to him for salvation, we now become part of the family of God. A great tree in which we're grafted in, even though we are of the Gentile, like Ruth. Beautiful imagery being given to us as a redemption for the nation is hinted at right here by our Lord. So like I said, Naomi wants to help Ruth get that man. And now she's going to tell her just how to do it. Wash therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. A lot of commands, right? And what's even more fascinating is when you go into the Hebrew, all of these commands start with the prefix, you could say, wa. And I'm probably not saying it right. My apologies to any Hebrews, people who understand the language, but W-A-W. And again, I'm using English letters for Hebrew words, but this wa is kind of a sense of do. And that's what she keeps saying over and over again to her. That should remind us of something. Mount Sinai, where God puts his law on his people. You should do this, do that, don't do this, don't eat that. Commands are given to them. Boom, 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 boom. And here's Naomi doing the same thing. Follow all these commands. Wah. Do. Thrown at her. She's given all these rules and commands like Israel was at Mount Sinai. Will she obey? Is a great question because they didn't. We know, especially with the time of the judges, they didn't, but even in the desert, they didn't. Will she? Will she take what is said to her and do it? And when thinking of connecting it back to the Mount Sinai, think of this idea of wait until he's finished eating and drinking. Because, here's where it gets interesting. Not only was Israel told to get ready to meet God, right? Anoint yourself, wash yourself, get ready to meet God because he's coming down at Mount Sinai. But also, the leaders were called to go up halfway through the mountain. Leaders like the priests and the other leaders of the people, and to eat there, in a sense, with God. You can see the imagery, I hope. Where again, this is where the covenant was made and the people promised to obey all these commands God gave them. But they didn't. Will Ruth? By the way, if you're asking yourself, what is this idea of the cloak? It is interesting because most probably the idea is that she was wearing a widow's clothes. Kind of saying, I'm still living my mourning for the fact that I lost my husband. I'm not ready to get married. And then Naomi's saying, take that off now. Put on the clothes that says, I am ready to get married. I am a single now. I've done my mourning. It's over. I'm ready to marry. I believe that's probably what she's going at here. But either way, it's go and show yourself to Boaz that you are ready for marriage. A bit again where Israel kind of covenant in a marriage type thing with the Lord. Naomi's not finished though. Yeah, she's going to say, but when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lay down, and he will tell you what to do. That's weird. What she's saying to Ruth is weird. I've read many commentaries, and honestly, nobody knows exactly if this was a custom in the day or something Naomi made up. Was there any significance behind this idea of uncovering his feet? Nobody knows. There's nothing concrete. All we know is she was told to do it. And, of course, she does. Now, there is something interesting about the idea of the uncovering the feet when you think of the fact that Israel was told to stay at the foot of the mountain. And that's where they would receive the law. Go to his feet, and he'll tell you what to do. Makes me think of that. Stay at the feet of the mountain, and God will give you his laws. And you're supposed to obey it. Just like she was supposed to do exactly what Boaz would tell her. The same way she is doing everything Ruth is saying, then you're going to do everything Boaz is saying. Just like they followed Moses all the way to Sinai, and they're supposed to take the law and obey it when God speaks. But they didn't. They murmured and rebelled. But Ruth, of course, she'll obey. So can't be sure exactly what this whole purpose of this covering the feet and everything, other than just meet him one to one and when wake him up. You need to talk to Boaz and Boaz alone and nobody else. That's the best we can do. But like I said, we need to focus back on this great Sinai moment of covenant and obedience and failure to then wonder, well, what about Ruth then? I kept saying it, but here's what Ruth replies. All that you say, I will do. Which kind of sounds like Israel, though, at the foot of Mount Sinai. After the law has come down to them, we will do it, we will do it. And they didn't. They didn't right away in the desert. They didn't when they entered Canaan. They didn't during the time of the judges. They just never did it. But Ruth, as we will see, she does. She will fully obey. She will do everything that is asked of her. Everything her mother-in-law says and everything that comes out of Boaz, she will do. She's the obedient one, but she's a Moabitess, not an Israelite. She's like a provocation for the first readers of seeing this Moabitess being faithful at this place of commands where Israel was not. And even for us, but it's a good reminder that our covenant of grace does not exclude obedience and commands or obeying what God says. On the contrary, it empowers us. This new covenant is God's Spirit in us, circumcising our hearts, even so willing in the doing, a love for the law of God. That's the difference. We're supposed to obey. We come to the mountain and we say yes, and we can now because of His Spirit in us. When you realize that in this discussion, Boaz will whittle, right, get the shaft out and eat and sleep. Naomi, she wants to seek for Ruth, which is not great, but she only does one thing. She just gives commands. Ruth is the one getting all these commands, and she does them. She obeys them. Make like Christ, who is the faithful one, who the whole law is put on His shoulders and He fulfills it. The whole weight of judgment is put on Him and He takes it. Of course, I'm not saying Ruth is Christ, but still, He is our faithful, obedient Redeemer. But as I said, when you look at Ruth in this conversation, you see obedience, you see faithfulness, and you see a good reminder for us to do the same thing. Now, hopefully this has been encouraging, brothers and sisters. On this note, be blessed.